AITA for staying silent in court until the judge revealed my secret identity to my wife. In the courtroom, the air was thick. Claire Sterling, flawless in her pearls, had just dropped the sentence she intended to use as the final blow to secure total control over her husband's life. He is just a useless husband. Arthur remained motionless, his hands flat on the table, without saying a single word. He didn't yell, he didn't protest, he didn't defend himself. But what Claire didn't expect was the judge's reaction. Instead of granting the petition, the magistrate lowered her glasses, looked at Claire's lawyer with an expression of pure disbelief, and asked, "Counselor, are you certain you understand who Mr. Sterling is and what he actually does?" In that second, the color drained from Claire's face. She realized that in 26 years of marriage, she might not know the man sitting next to her. He is just a useless husband. Claire said this in the middle of an open court, without anger, without emotion, like someone reading a conclusion they had drawn years ago. I remained silent. The judge didn't respond immediately. She looked away from my wife and fixed her eyes on her lawyer. Her head tilted slightly, not in anger, but in curiosity. And then she asked the question that cut through the air of that room like a knife. "Counselor," she said with a calm and precise voice, "are you certain you understand who Mr. Sterling is and what he actually does?" Claire stiffened. Her lawyer hesitated, and for the first time that morning, Claire Sterling's confidence cracked. The clock above the judge's bench read 9:14 when Claire finished speaking. Courtroom 3B of the DuPage County Courthouse was smaller than people imagine when they think of a courtroom. No dramatic echoes, no gallery packed with onlookers, just worn wooden benches, neon lighting, and that subtle smell of paper and disinfectant that clings to public buildings, regardless of how often they are cleaned. I was sitting at the defendant's table, my hands resting on the surface, palms facing down. I learned a long time ago that clenched fists invite interpretations. Quiet hands do not. I am 52 years old, married to Claire for 26 years. And until 3 weeks before that hearing, no one, in any conversation, in any document, had ever suggested that I was incapable of managing my own life. Claire was positioned a few feet away from me, slightly turned toward the judge. A navy blue blazer, neutral makeup, the pearl necklace she wore whenever she wanted to appear composed, yet approachable. She had rehearsed this version of herself carefully. I recognized it because I had lived with that version for decades. Her lawyer, Derek Hayes, had just finished presenting the petition. He described Claire as a wife who had carried the family's financial and emotional responsibilities for years. He described me as someone withdrawn, passive, and chronically disengaged from long-term planning. He emphasized concern, stability, protection. Then Claire dropped the sentence she had clearly saved for impact. "He is just a useless husband. He doesn't understand finances. He never has." She didn't look at me when she said that. I didn't react. Not because it didn't hurt. It hurt, but reacting would have fed her narrative. Claire always believed that silence meant emptiness. She mistook restraint for absence. That misconception was the foundation of everything that would follow. Judge Patricia Caldwell leaned back slightly in her chair. She was in her 60s, with precision-cut silver hair and reading glasses sliding down her nose. She had that calm, economical presence of someone who has heard thousands of stories and learned to see the seams where they fall apart. She didn't look at me. She looked at Derek. "Counselor," she said with the same voice of someone pointing out a contradiction without needing to state it, "are you sure you understand Mr. Sterling's professional background?" Derek blinked. "Yes, Your Honor. He works in operations, risk management, I believe." The judge tilted her head slightly. "And are you sure that is the complete picture?" A pause, not long, but long enough for the room to notice. Claire turned to me at that moment. Her expression darkened a bit. She wasn't scared yet, but something had changed. I hadn't planned for this moment to arrive so soon. I expected to sit in silence through another hour of testimony before anything shifted. But Judge Caldwell had a habit, one I recognized from watching her preside over other cases years earlier. When something didn't add up, she asked direct questions sooner rather than later. That habit was exactly why I was there. 3 weeks prior to that hearing, Claire had filed an emergency petition asking the court to appoint her as my temporary financial guardian. Not for my mother, for me. She claimed I was incapable of recognizing exploitation, unable to manage assets responsibly, and emotionally compromised by long-standing detachment. Within 48 hours of that filing, my personal accounts were frozen for review. My employer placed me on administrative leave as a precaution. My access to certain internal systems was suspended. The word incompetent hadn't been said out loud yet, but it hovered. I didn't protest publicly. I didn't accuse Claire. I didn't call relatives to plead my case. I read. I have spent most of my adult life working in compliance and internal risk analysis. Not the glamorous kind. I don't make headlines or testify in court often. I support investigations, review financial systems, document inconsistencies, and advise companies when something looks wrong. Occasionally, rarely, I am called to explain findings in legal proceedings. Quiet work, without celebration. Work that Claire always dismissed as shuffling paperwork. When my mother, Eleanor Sterling, suffered a mild stroke 8 months earlier, Claire offered to handle the logistics. Appointments, bills, documents. She said she would take the pressure off me while I focused on caregiving. I let her. Eleanor trusted Claire, or maybe she trusted the marriage. Either way, papers were signed in moments of exhaustion. Accounts were accessed for convenience. Claire became the point of contact with institutions that previously dealt directly with my mother. Then, Eleanor died. 3 weeks after the funeral, the petition arrived. Sitting in that courtroom, listening to my wife describe me as useless, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, clarity. Claire wasn't improvising. That was a plan. And that plan relied on me continuing to be exactly who she believed I was. Quiet, inattentive, disconnected. She didn't realize that silence never meant I wasn't paying attention. Judge Caldwell tapped her pen lightly against the bench and turned to me for the first time. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "you have remained silent until now. Is that intentional?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Why?" I met her gaze. "Because this petition relies on assumptions, and assumptions tend to fall apart when the facts are presented too early." The room stopped. Claire held her breath. Judge Caldwell studied me for a moment, then nodded. "Very well, Ms. Flynn. You may proceed when you are ready." Rachel Flynn, my attorney, slowly stood up from her chair, and Claire Sterling, for the first time since she filed that petition, looked uncertain. The first time Claire called me useless wasn't in court. It was at our kitchen table years earlier, on a night that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and lemon cleaner. Our son Connor had just left for college. Our daughter Maya was still in high school. The house was quieter than ever, as if it were waiting for something we couldn't name. Claire was standing at the counter, sorting through the mail, flipping envelopes with quick, irritated movements. She didn't look at me when she spoke. "What is your plan?" she asked. "For what?" I said. She sighed. "Short, theatrical. For everything, Arthur. For your career, for us. You just float." I remember nodding. I remember not saying anything. At the time, I thought restraint was maturity, that silence kept arguments from turning into scars. What I didn't yet understand was that silence could be redefined. Over time, Claire turned mine into evidence. Our marriage always ran on parallel tracks. We shared a house, raised children, coordinated schedules, but our inner lives rarely crossed. Claire liked visibility. She thrived on being seen as competent, admired, indispensable. I liked systems. I liked order. I liked knowing that if something went wrong, I could trace it back to the source. She dealt with people. I dealt with processes. Gradually, Claire took over everything that required a signature. She moved our savings to another bank without telling me. She added herself as the primary contact on our insurance. She told the kids to ask her about money, because your father doesn't like dealing with it. When I gently resisted, she framed it as my reluctance. "You hate the responsibility," she would say. "I am helping you." And because I didn't want to fight, I let it go. The shift with my mother happened quietly. Eleanor was always meticulous with her finances. She balanced her checkbook every Sunday morning with a cup of coffee, 2 sugars, a splash of milk. She kept receipts in labeled envelopes. She liked knowing where every dollar went. After my dad died, she told me, "Paper is memory, don't lose it." When she started forgetting small things, I noticed before Claire did. Or maybe Claire had noticed and didn't say anything. Either way, Claire stepped in with the confidence of someone who knows what they are doing. She scheduled appointments, went to the bank. "Let me handle the boring parts," she said. "You already do enough." Eleanor trusted her. Claire was family. She was warm, attentive, capable. When Claire brought documents to sign, Eleanor didn't question them. She was tired. She was recovering. She assumed good faith. I assumed it too. The first warning sign came months later, when Claire casually mentioned she had been rearranging some things in Eleanor's accounts to simplify them. I asked what she meant. She waved me off. Just tidying up the house, nothing to worry about. But worrying is a habit that isn't easily unlearned. 3 weeks after Eleanor's funeral, the house filled with the usual rituals. Platters of food, condolence cards, conversations that never got to the point. Claire took the reins, coordinated with the funeral home, answered calls, thanked people on my behalf. 3 weeks later, the petition arrived by courier, thick and official, addressed to me by my full name. I sat in my car in the driveway for several minutes before opening it, watching the condensation drip on the windshield. When I finally read the words financial incapacity and emergency guardianship, they seemed to belong to someone else's life. Claire was asking the court to name her my temporary financial guardian. Not because I had made irresponsible decisions, not because I had lost money, but because, according to her, I was incapable of recognizing exploitation. The irony was not lost on me. Within days, my accounts were frozen for review. My employer placed me on administrative leave out of an abundance of caution, no accusation, no explanation, just a suspension. Years of steady work reduced to a waiting period. Connor stopped answering my calls. Maya sent a single text message. Mom says you need help. That night, I slept on the couch. Claire didn't ask me to go there. She didn't have to. The next morning, I opened my laptop and started where I always start, with the records. I didn't accuse Claire. I didn't confront her. I didn't call anyone in the family to defend myself. I pulled bank statements, requested transaction histories, put together a timeline. Patterns don't announce themselves. They reveal themselves slowly, if you have patience. It took most of the day before I noticed the alignment. Small withdrawals, consulting fees, transfers just below reporting thresholds, all clustered around specific dates when Claire had visited my mother alone. I highlighted, cross-referenced, built a spreadsheet. By the end of the week, I had identified multiple transactions totaling tens of thousands of dollars that didn't correspond to any documented expense. When I asked Claire about one of them with neutral care, she smiled. Don't worry about it. It is handled. That was when it clicked. Not anger, not betrayal, but recognition. Claire didn't see herself as a thief. She saw herself as correcting an imbalance. She believed she deserved control because she believed she had carried the family for years, and she genuinely believed I would never notice. That belief was the most dangerous thing she brought into the courtroom. I didn't go back to my mother's house right away. That surprised even me. When I finally did, it was a gray Thursday morning. That Midwestern gray that flattens everything and makes colors recede. Oak Park was quiet. The neighborhood, unchanged in ways that felt almost ironic. The same brick houses, the same hedges trimmed to the exact edge, the same sidewalks my mother used to sweep every Saturday, as if someone were going to grade them. I parked in the driveway and sat there longer than necessary, hands on the steering wheel. The house didn't look like a scene of an incident. It looked like a life paused mid-sentence. I let myself in. The air smelled of lavender and old books. Eleanor's smell. The living room was tidy, but lived in. A throw blanket folded over the arm of the couch. A stack of library books on the side table. Her glasses upside down, exactly where she always left them. I went straight to the guest bedroom. Eleanor kept her records in a plain, beige, 4-drawer filing cabinet. Utility bills, medical documents, bank statements, tax returns. She labeled everything in neat block letters. After my dad died, she told me, if anything happens to me, you will know where to look. I opened every drawer. At first glance, nothing seemed wrong. The statements were there, the letters, the copies of checks. But after an hour, the patterns began to unravel. Resealed envelopes, statements out of sequence, gaps where the originals should be. I pulled everything onto the bed and started organizing by date. That was when I found the power of attorney. It wasn't hidden, it didn't need to be. It was in a folder marked legal, carefully filed among older documents. Eleanor's signature was there, real, but shaky in a way that matched the weeks following her stroke. The language was broad, too broad. It granted authority over financial decisions without significant limitations. But what caught my attention wasn't the scope of the document. It was the date. The document was signed on a day when Eleanor's neurologist had documented increased confusion and reduced executive functions. Not incompetence, but vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable, enough to make pressure effective. I photographed the document and kept looking. The journal came next. It was tucked between two photo albums in the hallway closet, a brown leather notebook soft around the edges from use. The kind of thing you don't buy by accident. Eleanor always liked objects that lasted. The first entry had been written 15 months before her passing. Claire called today, said she wants to help more. Seemed sincere. I want to believe it. The entries were short at first. Dates, visits, notes about fatigue. Claire bringing groceries, Claire asking questions about the bills. Then the tone changed. Foggy day. Claire had papers. Said they were to help her talk to the bank. I signed. I shouldn't have signed. Too tired to argue. 2 weeks later. Better day. Looked at the papers. Power of attorney. I didn't want to give that, but she said I needed to. I don't want to burden Arthur. My chest tightened. The last entry was addressed to me. If you are reading this, something went wrong. I haven't forgotten who you are. I know what you do. I trusted you to see what I couldn't. I sat on the floor of that closet for a long time, not crying, just breathing. When I left the house, I took copies of everything. The originals stayed where they were. Evidence is worth more when it hasn't been disturbed. That afternoon, I called Rachel Flynn. Rachel didn't react with emotion when I told her what I had found. She asked precise questions, dates, names, medical context. She listened the way investigators listen, without interrupting, without filling the silences. This isn't just about the power of attorney, she said when I finished. It's exploitation during vulnerability. That is a serious situation. She explained to me how these cases actually unfold. Adult Protective Services gets involved. Banks flag irregular activity. Courts analyze capacity on a spectrum, not as a binary. Claire's petition wasn't just aggressive, it was risky. If the court concluded that Eleanor was vulnerable, everything Claire touched would be scrutinized. What do you want to do? Rachel asked. I thought about the journal, my mother's careful handwriting, the way she had protected herself without confrontation. I want the truth to come out on its own, I said, without me forcing it. Rachel was quiet for a moment. Then we wait and prepare. For the next 2 weeks, I lived deliberately within Claire's expectations. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I answered her lawyer's questions minimally during the pre-hearing deposition. When they asked about my job, I described it simply. No embellishments, no voluntarily offered credentials. Internal audit consultant, compliance support, risk analysis. Claire watched the pre-hearing on video. I saw her relax as the deposition progressed. She smiled when I answered simply. She nodded when I didn't explain myself. She mistook restraint for surrender. In the background, Rachel worked. She requested bank statements through the proper channels. She coordinated with compliance officers who flagged transactions that didn't match their stated purposes. She discreetly alerted Adult Protective Services, triggering a parallel review. Not an accusation, an inquiry. As the hearing approached, multiple systems were already moving independently. That was important. The truth carries more weight when it doesn't depend on a single voice. The night before the hearing, I went back to Eleanor's house one last time. I didn't go inside. I sat in the car, parked by the curb, watching the porch light cast a familiar glow. I thought about how my mother had prepared for this, without knowing exactly how it would unfold. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't accuse. She left a trail. In the courtroom the next morning, when Claire spoke and Derek repeated her narrative, I remained silent. When Judge Caldwell asked her question, when the room paused, I understood that we had reached the point my mother had anticipated. The point where the quiet work begins to speak for itself. Courtroom 3B felt different after the judge's question. Not louder, not tense the way people imagine. It felt alert, as if the room itself had leaned forward, waiting to see which version of reality would hold up. Judge Caldwell didn't rush. She adjusted her glasses, looked once at the file in front of her, and turned directly to Rachel Flynn. Miss Flynn, she said, you may proceed. Rachel stood up slowly, without dramatics, without pacing the floor. She rested a hand on the table, steadied herself, and spoke in a tone that suggested she wasn't there to argue, only to clarify. "Your Honor," Rachel began. "This petition relies on the claim that Mr. Sterling lacks the capacity to recognize financial exploitation. What we intend to show is that the exact opposite is true, and that the exploitation occurred precisely because someone believed he wouldn't notice." She started with the bank statements, not all of them, just enough. A simple timeline appeared on the monitor. Dates on the left, transactions on the right. Withdrawals, transfers, payments labeled as administrative support and consulting. Nothing flashy, nothing obviously problematic on its own. These transactions, Rachel said, pointing to the screen, occurred over the course of 10 months. Each one coincides with a visit by Mrs. Sterling to Eleanor Sterling's residence. Not to doctor's appointments, not to the bank, to the residence. Derek Hayes stood halfway up. "Objection." "Overruled," the judge said calmly. "Continue." Rachel didn't linger. Next, she addressed the power of attorney. She didn't accuse Claire of anything directly. Instead, she framed the issue clinically. This document was signed on a date when Eleanor Sterling's neurologist documented increased confusion and reduced executive functions. Not incompetence, Your Honor, but vulnerability. Enough to make consent questionable, enough to make pressure effective. Judge Caldwell leaned slightly forward. "In Illinois," Rachel continued, "capacity is not binary. Consent obtained during vulnerability, especially without independent legal representation, requires scrutiny." Claire crossed her arms tightly. Rachel pressed on. "Following the execution of this document, Mrs. Sterling gained expanded access to Eleanor Sterling's accounts. That access coincides with a marked shift in transaction behavior." She clicked to the next slide. "Prior to this date, Eleanor Sterling's spending habits were consistent for over a decade. Utility bills, groceries, pharmacy. After this, we see discretionary withdrawals with no corresponding invoices, no medical billing, and no documentation supporting the stated purposes." Derek objected again. This time, his voice lacked conviction. Judge Caldwell overruled him without looking up. Rachel paused. "Your Honor," she said, "I believe context matters here." She turned slightly toward me. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "can you briefly explain what your professional role has been for the past 20 years? I stood up. "I work in internal compliance and risk analysis," I said. "I help organizations identify irregular financial behaviors and systemic weaknesses. Most of my work happens before anything becomes public." "Have you ever provided expert testimony in court?" the judge asked. "Yes," I said. "A few times, when companies needed to explain findings. Not often." Judge Caldwell nodded, then turned to Derek. "Counselor," she said, "was this background included in Mr. Sterling's capacity evaluation?" Derek hesitated. "We understood his role to be limited." "That," Judge Caldwell replied serenely, "seems to be an assumption." Claire stood up suddenly. "He doesn't like attention," she said sharply. "He hides behind spreadsheets. That doesn't make him competent." Judge Caldwell raised her hand. "Mrs. Sterling, sit down." Claire didn't argue, but her jaw clenched tight. Rachel resumed. She still hadn't presented the journal. Instead, she presented a summary from Adult Protective Services. Not a conclusion, an inquiry. APS had been notified, a preliminary review had been initiated, and banks had independently flagged irregularities. This court, Rachel said, was called to intervene because Mrs. Sterling claimed her husband couldn't recognize exploitation. Yet, multiple institutions have done so without him needing to ask. The judge's expression changed. "Ms. Flynn," she said slowly, "are you suggesting that this petition itself triggered a broader review?" "Yes, Your Honor. And that review is ongoing." Silence settled over the room, heavier this time. Judge Caldwell clasped her hands together. "Mrs. Sterling," she said, turning to Claire, "you requested emergency authority over your husband's finances. Based on what I've heard, that request seems premature." Claire opened her mouth, closed it. "I am denying the petition," Judge Caldwell continued, with prejudice. A pause. "And given the body of evidence presented and the ongoing independent inquiries, I am referring this matter to the state's attorney's office for further review." The words landed softly, but they landed. Claire's shoulders dropped, not in shame, but in calculation. She had lost control of the timeline. Judge Caldwell looked at me one last time. "Mr. Sterling," she said, "you did well to remain silent." I nodded once. When the gavel struck, I felt no euphoria. I felt alignment, as if something crooked had finally been straightened out. Outside the courtroom, Rachel leaned toward me. "This part is over," she said quietly. "The next part won't be like this." I knew, because when systems start moving, they rarely stop at the first truth they uncover. The courthouse doors closed behind us with a sound that felt final, but it wasn't. Outside, the air carried that tartness of early spring, cold enough to keep people moving. Rachel walked beside me toward the parking garage. "The petition was denied," she said. "But this is not the end." "I know," I replied. What surprised me was how little relief I felt. The denial had removed an immediate threat, but it hadn't restored anything Claire had broken. The accounts were still under review. My employer was still cautious. My children were still trapped between versions of the same story, and now the systems had noticed. Within 48 hours, the audit expanded. Not dramatically, no sirens, no confrontations. The banks simply did what banks are trained to do when APS opens a preliminary inquiry. They widened the scope. Eleanor's accounts were examined alongside any joint account Claire had access to. Transaction histories were requested, not for months, but for years. Patterns were compared across institutions. Rachel called me that night. "APS is formally involved now. They are not accusing. They are documenting. That matters." Claire didn't come home that night. Instead, she sent a short, performative text message. "We need to talk. You embarrassed me today." I didn't reply. The next morning, my cell phone rang before 8 a.m. It was Connor. His voice was tense, controlled, the way people sound when they're trying not to pick sides. "Mom says the judge overreacted," he said. "She says you set all this up." I leaned against the kitchen counter and closed my eyes. "What do you think?" I asked. A pause long enough for me to hear traffic on the other end. "I don't know," he admitted. "She always handled things. You always stayed out of it." "Staying out of it isn't the same as not paying attention," I said. He exhaled. "Maya is upset. Mom told her not to get involved." That tightened something inside me. "Tell her she doesn't have to choose," I said. "She just has to be honest with herself, if no one else." Connor didn't answer right away. "All right," he said finally. "I'll tell her." That afternoon, Rachel forwarded me an email from a bank compliance officer. The tone was neutral, procedural, the content wasn't. Multiple transactions had been flagged as inconsistent with stated purposes. Several payments routed through a third-party consulting entity raised concerns due to a lack of credentials and supporting documentation. A request for clarification had been sent to the account holder. "Claire is going to panic," Rachel said when I called her. "That is when mistakes happen." I didn't want Claire to panic. Panic makes people unpredictable. I wanted her to explain. Explanations leave trails. 2 days later, APS contacted me directly. A social worker named Karen Foster introduced herself over the phone. Her voice was calm, trained. "We are conducting a standard review related to Eleanor Sterling's accounts. We will need to speak with you and your wife separately." "Of course," I answered. Karen asked about Eleanor's habits, her routines, her independence before the stroke. I answered carefully, truthfully. I didn't accuse Claire. I described facts, dates, observations. Karen took notes and thanked me. "We will be in touch," she said. Claire arrived late that night, carrying a tension she didn't try to hide. "They are questioning me," she said, tossing her purse onto the table. "Banks, a social worker. Is this your fault?" I looked at her. She seemed smaller somehow, not diminished, but compressed by the weight of scrutiny. "This is the result of your petition," I said calmly. "You asked for oversight." She frowned. "I asked to protect the family, not for you to get involved." Her eyes flared. "You don't understand how things work, Arthur." I almost smiled. "Almost. Tell that to them," I said. She glared at me. Then she turned away, her jaw clenched. The following week stretched thin. APS interviewed Claire. Banks requested clarifications. Rachel coordinated with investigators, careful not to interfere. My employer extended my administrative leave, citing the ongoing external review. No promises, no timelines. Connor visited once. Briefly. He sat on the edge of the couch, avoiding my gaze. "She doesn't answer questions straight," he said quietly. "She keeps saying people are twisting things." "Do you believe her?" I asked. He hesitated. I don't know what to believe. That is honest, I said. Maya called 2 nights later. Her voice was shaking. Dad, I think I messed up. You didn't mess up, I said immediately. Whatever it is. She told me she had seen Claire wearing Eleanor's earrings months earlier. Family heirlooms. Claire had said Eleanor gave them to her as a gift. Maya hadn't questioned it at the time. I didn't tell anyone, Maya said. I was afraid Mom would get mad. You can tell APS, I said gently. You don't have to accuse her. Just say what you saw. She sniffled. Will it cause trouble? I thought of Eleanor's journal, her quiet preparation. No, I said. It will clarify things. The audit results arrived in pieces, not all at once. Each piece aligned with the last. Transfers routed through a third party. Loosely justified payments. Documentation created after the fact. Rachel called me one evening, her voice lower than usual. They identified the intermediary, she said. A woman named Vanessa Croft. Uncredentialed and bonded. She was contacted by investigators. Did she respond? I asked. Yes, Rachel said carefully. With legal representation. That mattered. It meant Vanessa wasn't acting on impulse. It meant this would unfold the way real cases unfold. Slowly, deliberately, with consequences measured in months, not moments. Rachel paused. Arthur, she said, be prepared. This is going to take time. Relationships won't be put back together. Some things won't go back to the way they were. I looked around the kitchen, the same table where Claire had called me useless. The same quiet corners where assumptions had hardened into truth. I am not looking for everything to go back, I said. I am looking for things to be honest. That is usually harder, Rachel replied. Over the next 3 weeks, the investigation expanded in small, methodical steps. APS concluded their initial assessment and forwarded the case to the county. Bank compliance units issued new requests. Subpoenas were drafted. Not dramatic, just precise. Each request pulled a thread. Claire tried to regain control, appearing cooperative. She attended interviews, answered emails promptly, framed every transfer as a misunderstanding, every payment as an administrative necessity. She leaned heavily on the idea that Eleanor wanted things handled quietly and that I had never had any interest. The investigators listened. Then they compared notes. The pattern didn't change. What changed was Claire's tone. She stopped calling me incompetent and started calling me manipulative. She told Connor I was weaponizing my job. She told Maya I was letting strangers tear the family apart. Each version contradicted the last. Each conversation left more residue. Connor withdrew. He no longer defended her, but he didn't confront her either. When he visited, he spoke in fragments, questions without conclusions. I let him. Maya, on the other hand, began to talk. Not all at once, not easily. She described moments she hadn't thought mattered. Her mother asking her to go to the bank for her, instructions to keep conversations vague, reminders to stay out of grown-up business. Nothing incriminating on its own. Together, they sketched an intent. Rachel warned me not to draw conclusions out loud. Let them put the puzzle together, she said. Your job is to remain consistent. That consistency mattered when the prosecutor's office finally reached out. Assistant State's Attorney Diane Hughes requested a meeting. No accusations, just a conversation. Rachel and I met her in a modest downtown conference room. Diane didn't waste time. We are looking at potential charges related to the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, she said. Possibly fraud, possibly more, depending on how certain documents were utilized. I asked the only question that mattered. What happens now? Evidence review, she answered. Witness cooperation. If charges are formally filed, we will likely offer a plea deal. If it isn't accepted, we move forward. She looked at me carefully. This is not going to be fast. I am not in a hurry, I said. That night, Claire finally confronted me directly. She waited until the house was quiet, until the kids were gone, until it felt safe to control the narrative again. Did you do this? She said, standing across the room. You could have stopped this at any time. I looked at her. No anger, no defensiveness. I didn't start it, I said, and I can't stop what I didn't create. She laughed, a brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. You always hide behind procedures and systems. You act like you are better than all this. I am not better, I replied. I am inside it. Her expression changed then, not quite to fear, but to calculation. They are not going to move forward with this, are they? She said. Not for this. I didn't answer. 2 weeks later, Claire was indicted. The indictment listed charges under Illinois law related to the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult and fraudulent documentation. Not the maximum charges, not the minimums. Just enough to anchor the case. She wasn't taken into custody in a dramatic raid. She was notified through her lawyer and turned herself in voluntarily. The process was procedural, predictable, public record, but not a spectacle. Derek Hayes resigned as her attorney the next day. Plea negotiations took months. Claire rejected the first offer, then the second. She insisted on explanations that contradicted the evidence. She blamed stress. She blamed the marriage. She blamed me. Finally, the paper trail closed the remaining exits. The transfers, the intermediary, the timing, the power of attorney executed during documented vulnerability, the lack of independent representation for Eleanor, the inconsistencies that Claire could no longer reconcile. She accepted a plea deal for a Class 2 felony. The sentence reflected what these cases usually reflect when the amounts are significant, but the defendant has no prior record. A suspended prison sentence, 3 years of conditional discharge, 5 years of probation, full restitution with interest, mandatory financial disclosure, and a permanent ban on acting as a fiduciary or managing anyone else's assets. To satisfy the restitution, Claire was forced to liquidate assets. The house went on the market. Not ours, but hers. A property she had quietly purchased the year before under the name of a trust she could no longer justify. I wasn't there when the judge accepted the plea. Rachel was. She called me afterward. "It's over," she said. I sat at the kitchen table and let that settle. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a redistribution of weight, as if something heavy had finally been placed where it belonged. The fallout rippled outward. My employer reinstated me, but not immediately. There was a probationary period, additional disclosures, discreet monitoring. No punishment, just caution. I accepted it. Some systems are slow to forgive. Connor took longer. He oscillated between anger and grief, not always sure which belonged where. We talked. We didn't resolve everything. That wasn't the point. Healing, I learned, doesn't follow verdicts. Maya started therapy, then asked me if I would go to a session with her. I went. The turning point with Connor came unexpectedly. He called one evening and asked if I still had Eleanor's recipe box. "I found something," he said. He came over that weekend and pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. A bank notice dated years ago, addressed to Eleanor, forwarded to Claire's email. "I found it in Mom's old files," Connor said quietly. "She never mentioned this." I looked at him, at the way his hands shook slightly holding the paper. "It is okay," I said. "You don't have to fix this." "I know," he answered. "I just needed you to know I see it now." It was enough. Maya's healing looked different. Therapy helped. Distance helped. She didn't excuse Claire, but she didn't cut her off completely either. She slowly learned that loving someone doesn't require defending their choices. Watching her learn that taught me something, too. Claire never apologized. She complied, attended the mandatory sessions, paid the restitution, followed the terms of her probation, but genuine remorse requires looking inward. And Claire had spent too much time outsourcing that work. I stopped waiting. Months later, I received one last letter. Not from Claire, but from the court clerk. Confirmation that the restitution had been completed, that Eleanor's estate was officially closed, that the chapter was sealed. I sat at the kitchen table that night with nothing spread out in front of me. No documents, no timelines, no spreadsheets. Just a cup of coffee and the silence I once mistook for emptiness. I thought about the word useless. How easily it had been spoken, with how much confidence it had been believed. Silence doesn't mean ignorance. Calmness doesn't mean weakness. And being underestimated is only dangerous if you believe it, too. Claire thought my quietness made me invisible. She thought my restraint meant detachment. She thought paper was something you could rearrange without consequence. She forgot that paper has a memory. Comment. I want to take a moment to talk about how we perceive quietness in our daily lives. People often mistake patience for weakness and silence for a lack of awareness. However, true strength does not always need to be loud or reactive. Setting clear boundaries is a profound way to protect your peace and self-worth. Living with integrity means choosing to do the right thing even when nobody is watching. Healing from broken trust takes time and requires an honest look inward. Please remember that loving someone does not mean you have to excuse their harmful choices. Moving forward is rarely about seeking revenge. Rather, it is about finding clarity and accepting the truth. I hope you always value your own quiet strength and never let anyone underestimate your worth. Thank you for being part of this community and sharing these reflections with me. If you liked it, don't forget to leave a comment and support the channel by subscribing. See you in the upcoming stories.